Here's my audience. What does a member of the Air Force, a trained conductor, a best-selling author, a Grammy Award winner, a radio DJ, and a comedian all have in common? They're all ways to describe the infamous George Carlin. George Carlin is my all-time favorite comedian. I've spent countless hours of my life laughing at his jokes. Carlin was a master of words. His comedy routines were hypnotic, even rhythmic at times. He had the ability to inform, infuriate, offend, and relate to his listeners, all while making them laugh. For George Carlin, comedy was not about making cheap, dirty jokes, but a reflection of his perspectives on life. George Carlin dedicated his life to comedy. I will show how George Carlin dedicated his life to comedy through the following three main points. First, George Carlin rose from humble beginnings. Second, George Carlin changed the face of entertainment. And third, George Carlin is an accomplished, influential comedian. George Carlin dedicated his life to comedy. George Carlin's life dedication to comedy began at a very young age. To begin, George Carlin rose from humble beginnings. In an interview George Carlin participated in 9 days before his death in 2008 and published later that year in Psychology Today, he gives us a brief glimpse into his childhood. Carlin tells us that in the year 1937, during the midst of the Great Depression, his mother left his alcoholic father when he was just 2 months old. He credits his mother for saving his life and taking him away from his abusive father. With such a difficult beginning, it's hard to realize how his family would ever find the time to laugh. However, in the interview, Carlin shares with us that his mother loved to laugh. He recalls the first time he made her mother laugh fondly, saying he wouldn't have remembered it so well if it hadn't meant so much to him. A quick look at his credentials posted on the website biography.com prove it was that love of making people laugh that fueled his thirst for performing comedy. Carlin was a high school dropout, and at the age of 17 he joined the Air Force. His career in the military would be short-lived though. He received 3 court-martials and numerous disciplinary punishments before finally being discharged. It was while in the Air Force that he first got his first radio gig. And after discharge, he continued with various jobs in radio and would meet the people who would help him launch into superstardom. George Carlin rose from humble beginnings and prevailed over adversities life threw his way. He worked tirelessly at becoming a successful comedian, and that leads me to my second main point. George Carlin changed the face of entertainment. George Carlin's biography on biography.com highlights his early accomplishments. George Carlin's comedy career began as a comedy team with partner and radio co-host Jack Burns, and together they hosted radio programs in Texas and Hollywood. They appeared on The Tonight Show several times, and even after the comedy team broke up, George Carlin continued to perform as a solo act in Return to The Tonight Show and Merv Griffin. Carlin wrote and performed clean comedy in the 1960s, and in the 1970s he recharacterized himself and started to write and perform more socially and politically controversial material as he tested the limits of his First Amendment rights. George Carlin's routine 7 words you could never say on television, which I will not be repeating, would change the way the FCC regulated speech over the airwaves for generations to come, and even today. An article published in the 2008 issue of the American Bar Association Journal brings up this historical battle between George Carlin and the FCC. In 1973, a New York City DJ played a recording of his routine 7 words you can never say on television in the middle of the afternoon. Well, what happened was a man filed a formal complaint with the FCC after hearing it in his car while his son was riding in the car with him. The son was only 12 years old. Now, why he didn't just change radio station, I don't know. But anyway, the court battles went on for 5 years until in 1978 the Supreme Court ruled for the FCC, upholding the government's right to fine stations for airing indecent material during hours that children may be listening. That would be 6 in the morning till 10 at night. The battle fought nearly 40 years ago is still relevant today. His steps into the ring of controversy were not in distaste, nor were they for reasons of rebellion. George Carlin was a societal observer and merely reported on what he saw by sharing his personal interpretations through comedy. In that respect, George Carlin changed the face of entertainment. His works did, will, and continue to influence many. My third main point acts as a tribute to his contributions. George Carlin is an accomplished, influential comedian. Biography.com lists several of George Carlin's accomplishments. George Carlin's dedication to his craft is proven through the many awards he received throughout his half-century-long career. During that time, he performed on The Tonight Show 130 times, starred in 14 HBO specials, won 2 Grammy Awards, authored the best-selling book Brain Droppings, which would spend 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. He was a TV and film actor, was named the second best comedian of all time by Comedy Central, listed just behind Richard Pryor, and just 5 days before his death, it was announced he would receive the 11th annual Mark Twain Prize for American Humor. Clearly, George Carlin has proven himself as a powerful force in the realm of comedy, from which other comics have learned from and or admired. Ultimately, he became an American cultural icon. Ray Richmond, a writer for The Hollywood Reporter, wrote an obituary for George Carlin shortly after his death in 2008. On June 22nd that year, George Carlin's life came to an abrupt ending as a result of a heart attack. Richmond writes to the character of Carlin and recalls an event the two participated in together just 1 month before the comic genius's death. He writes that at first he was scared of meeting Carlin, but then explains how that fear was fruitless and describes Carlin as warm, animated, and kind. Even further, from his interview in Psychology Today, Carlin describes his own outlook on humanity by stating he's contemptuous of the mass, but one-on-one with people, he has great compassion. So as you can see, George Carlin is an accomplished, influential comedian. He was a living legend, and his legacy will live well into the future. He stood up for what he believed in, he wasn't afraid to offend, defended free speech, and continues to be a great influence for comedians around the world. He's forever immortalized through his words, and if you have not experienced Carlin, I encourage you to seek out his books and performances, many of which are available on YouTube. George Carlin lived every second of his life for one purpose, to write and perform, and that's just what he did up until his untimely death at the age of 71. My 3 main points have clearly explained how George Carlin dedicated his life to comedy. First, George Carlin rose from humble beginnings. Second, George Carlin changed the face of entertainment. And third, George Carlin is an accomplished, influential comedian.